Welcome to History Teller YT, where the past isn't just remembered, it's revived. Today we dive into one of the most dramatic, complex, and world-shaping stories of modern history. The rise of Mikhail Gorbachev, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the birth of a new global order. This isn't just a history lesson. This is the story of how an empire collapsed without a world war. How one leader's vision of openness and reform spiraled beyond his control. How 15 new nations were born from the ruins of a superpower. And how the aftershocks of 1991 still rattle the world we live in today, from Europe to Asia to the Middle East to the United States itself. In this full series, we'll journey through the chaos of perestroika and glasnost, the 1989 revolutions in Eastern Europe, the rise of oligarchs and the reawakening of Russian power, the conflicts in Chechnya, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, China's strategic transformation after watching the Soviet collapse, America's unchallenged dominance in the 1990s, and the long-term consequences that shape modern geopolitics today. If you want to understand why today's world looks the way it does, you must understand the story of how the Soviet Union fell. So sit back, open your mind, and let's travel into one of history's greatest turning points. This is the fall of the Soviet Union, only on History Teller YT. The Soviet Union in the early 1980s was a titan that seemed immovable from the outside, but increasingly hollow on the inside. Its achievements, the victory over Nazi Germany, the first satellite in space, the industrial rise of the mid-20th century, remained powerful symbols, yet they masked the deep structural decay spreading underneath. By 1982, the nation was facing systemic malaise that Soviet citizens openly acknowledged in private, but rarely dared to discuss publicly. The economy remained heavily centralized, rigidly planned, and overwhelmingly focused on heavy industry rather than consumer welfare. Factories met quotas on paper, but produced goods no one wanted or goods that barely worked. Shelves were often empty, and citizens became accustomed to waiting in lines for meat, fruit, or even basic household items that Western shoppers took for granted. The underground economy, informal bartering, unregistered repairs, and small-scale black market trade grew steadily because it filled gaps that the planned system could not. Additionally, decades of political ossification eroded the inner dynamism of the Communist Party. The so-called era of stagnation under Leonid Brezhnev produced a leadership culture where taking risks was discouraged and innovation was overshadowed by the need to preserve the appearance of stability. Aging officials remained entrenched, creating a gerontocracy disconnected from the everyday experiences of citizens. The government still invested enormous sums into the military and global competition with the United States, but it did little to reform the domestic economy that was quietly deteriorating. As the Soviet Union entered the 1980s, it carried all the symbols of great power status, but lacked the fundamental sustainability needed for long-term survival. The stage was set for a leader who recognized the depth of these problems and sought to confront them, even if doing so would unleash forces far beyond his control. By the time Yuri Andropov and later Konstantin Chernenko briefly occupied the office of General Secretary, the Soviet system was showing unmistakable signs of exhaustion. Andropov attempted modest anti-corruption initiatives and encouraged greater labor discipline, but his failing health prevented him from implementing meaningful reform. Chernenko's tenure was even shorter and even less effective, dominated by a return to symbolic conservatism rather than substantive change. Meanwhile, across the USSR's vast territory, problems were multiplying. Agricultural output stagnated, oil revenues fluctuated, and the cost of maintaining a superpower military burdened the economy at levels that were becoming unsustainable. Younger officials within the Politburo recognized these warning signs but struggled to build consensus in a political structure dominated by older, risk-averse bureaucrats. Internationally, relations with the West deteriorated due to the continuing arms race and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which had begun in 1979 and remained an expensive, bloody conflict with no clear victory in sight. As coffins returned from Central Asia and stories spread of corruption and mismanagement within the military, public trust in the government eroded further. Many Soviet families quietly wondered how long the state could continue projecting power abroad while failing to provide basic goods at home. Even within party circles, a silent acknowledgement formed. The Soviet Union was approaching a crossroads. Without some form of economic restructuring and social renewal, the system might stagnate into collapse or face public frustration that could no longer be contained. Yet no one anticipated how rapidly and dramatically events would unfold once a younger, more energetic leader took power. The USSR stood on the verge of profound transformation, one that very few inside or outside the country fully anticipated. When Mikhail Gorbachev emerged as General Secretary in March 1985, he represented a striking break from the Soviet leadership norms of the previous 2 decades. At 54, he was far younger than his immediate predecessors and carried an aura of energy that was rare in the top ranks of the Communist Party. His background, shaped by experiences in rural Russia and later by rapid advancement through the party's agricultural sector, gave him a different perspective on the failures of the Soviet system. He had seen shortages firsthand, listened to frustrated factory managers, and witnessed the inefficiencies that plagued collective farms. Unlike the aging elites who had long accepted the system's stagnation, Gorbachev believed the Soviet Union could still revive itself, but only if it confronted its shortcomings with honesty and courage. Gorbachev's early speeches emphasized oskorny, acceleration, promising modernization and greater economic efficiency. However, he quickly realized that superficial adjustments would not resolve the deep structural rot undermining the country. Soviet citizens, initially optimistic, sensed that Gorbachev's leadership signaled a real departure from tradition. His charisma, personal openness, and willingness to speak directly with ordinary people generated excitement, both domestically and internationally. Yet the same traits that made him popular also foreshadowed the challenges ahead. By encouraging transparency and inviting criticism, he was loosening the very foundation of Soviet political control. When he introduced the twin policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, they were meant to save socialism through reform. Instead, they would open vast, new spaces for debate, expose hidden failures, and ignite political forces that would eventually contribute to the Soviet Union's dissolution. His rise marked the beginning of a period of rapid, unpredictable change that reshaped the global order. Glasnost was more than a political slogan. It represented a philosophical shift in how the Soviet state understood truth, power, and the relationship between government and society. For decades, the Soviet system had depended on controlling narratives, suppressing criticism, and shaping public perception through state-run media. Problems such as industrial accidents, environmental disasters, corruption scandals, and economic failures were concealed from the public, creating a political culture built on secrecy. Gorbachev believed that this secrecy was not a safeguard but a poison, a mechanism that prevented the party from learning from its mistakes and confronting reality. Glasnost sought to cure this political culture by introducing openness, an unprecedented willingness to discuss past errors, ongoing problems, and alternative ideas for the future. At first, glasnost appeared cautiously. Newspapers printed mild critiques of bureaucracy, while television programs highlighted inefficiencies in factories or ministries. But the demand for openness grew rapidly. Citizens long accustomed to silence began to share frustrations. Journalists pushed boundaries, and intellectuals demanded not just transparency, but accountability. Gorbachev's advisors saw glasnost as essential to economic reform. Without honest information, perestroika would be impossible. Yet they underestimated the public desire for truth after decades of repression. Once people were invited to speak, the floodgates opened. Glasnost transformed Soviet political discourse from a controlled monologue into a chaotic, passionate dialogue that the government quickly struggled to manage. Rather than stabilizing the system, it revealed deep grievances that shook public confidence in the party's legitimacy. Under glasnost, the Soviet media underwent a transformation unmatched in its history. Newspapers like Pravda and Izvestia, once mouthpieces for state propaganda, began publishing investigative reports on corruption within the party, failures of central planning, and environmental catastrophes that had been hidden for years. One of the most shocking revelations concerned the 1986 Chernobyl disaster. Initially concealed by officials, the truth eventually surfaced through glasnost-driven reporting, exposing not only the technological flaws that caused the meltdown, but also the systemic negligence and secrecy that had amplified its consequences. This event became symbolic of how dangerous the old culture of silence had been and why openness was necessary. Cultural institutions flourished as well. Previously banned books, films, and music resurfaced. Soviet citizens gained access to works by authors such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn and previously censored accounts of Stalinist repression. Writers and artists pushed boundaries, exploring themes of individuality, historical trauma, and political critique. Public debates on once taboo subjects, religion, sexuality, nationalism, political pluralism, spread across the country. Libraries saw surges of visitors eager to consume newly available literature, and television talk shows invited intellectuals, scientists, and activists to discuss reforms with unprecedented frankness. While this cultural awakening revitalized Soviet society, it also destabilized traditional power structures. As citizens learned about past injustices, trust in the system eroded more quickly than Gorbachev had anticipated. Glasnost had begun as a tool for reform, but was quickly evolving into a catalyst for revolutionary change. The rapid expansion of glasnost had profound unintended consequences that reshaped the political landscape of the USSR. As historical archives opened and citizens learned about the scale of Stalinist purges, forced collectivization, and political repression, outrage spread across the republics. Public trust in the Communist Party plummeted. Grassroots movements formed, demanding accountability for past crimes and greater autonomy in the present. Nationalist sentiments, long suppressed, re-emerged powerfully in the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and parts of Central Asia. Instead of uniting the population around reform, glasnost exposed deep fractures, ethnic tensions, economic inequalities, and divergent political aspirations. Moreover, the newly liberated press became a platform for outspoken critics who argued that communist rule itself, not simply economic mismanagement, was the root cause of the nation's problems. As debates intensified, Gorbachev faced pressure from all sides. Conservative hardliners accused him of destroying socialism, while radicals accused him of not moving fast enough. The political center, which he hoped to strengthen, began collapsing under the weight of competing demands. Glasnost had achieved its goal of transparency, but at a cost. It undermined the authority of the very institutions needed to carry out perestroika. What Gorbachev intended as controlled reform had become a nationwide reckoning with truth, a force that neither he nor the party could fully contain. The Soviet Union was awakening, but its awakening threatened to tear the country apart. Perestroika, meaning restructuring, began as Gorbachev's bold attempt to repair the Soviet Union from within, but from the beginning it carried a level of ambition unmatched by any previous reform effort. Unlike limited economic tweaks attempted during Khrushchev's era or the anti-corruption campaigns under Andropov, perestroika sought to fundamentally redesign how the Soviet economy functioned. Its incentives, its productivity, its decision-making, and its relationship to everyday citizens. At its core, perestroika acknowledged a truth that few within the Politburo had previously dared to admit publicly. The centrally planned economy was no longer capable of sustaining the needs of a modern superpower. Industrial machinery was outdated, productivity lagged far behind Western competitors, and the quality gap between Soviet consumer goods and those produced abroad widened with every passing year. Gorbachev believed that only deep structural transformation, rather than patchwork repair, could rescue the system from collapse. The early phase of perestroika emphasized decentralization. Factories and enterprises were encouraged to make decisions independently rather than waiting for directives from Moscow. Managers were told to focus on profitability, efficiency, and innovation rather than simply meeting arbitrary production quotas that often resulted in waste and shortages. The government introduced laws allowing cooperatives, small, semi-private businesses, to operate legally for the first time since the early Soviet period. This alone was revolutionary. Across the country, restaurants, repair shops, bakeries, taxi services, and trade cooperatives opened, offering goods and services that the state had long failed to provide. Citizens encountered a new kind of economic freedom, noticing that when people were allowed to work for themselves and profit from their labor, productivity and creativity surged. Yet this also created tension with the old guard, who saw such reforms as a betrayal of socialist principles and a slippery slope toward capitalism. Despite its lofty goals, perestroika soon faced obstacles rooted deeply in the Soviet administrative structure. Bureaucrats resisted losing control, ministries sabotaged reforms to protect their authority, and local officials stalled implementation to avoid blame for potential failures. Moreover, the partial nature of the reforms created contradictions. While cooperatives could operate freely, state enterprises still relied on outdated planning mechanisms, creating imbalances in supply and pricing. Some sectors moved toward market freedom, while others remained trapped in rigid command structures. These contradictions would later amplify economic instability. But in the mid-1980s, perestroika was still viewed by reformers as the country's best hope, a daring attempt to modernize the world's largest socialist state without abandoning its ideological foundations. As perestroika unfolded, the gap between its theoretical promise and its real-world consequences widened dramatically. While the reforms aimed to boost productivity and empower local decision-making, the transition exposed fundamental weaknesses in the Soviet economy that had been concealed under decades of centralized planning. Factories accustomed to guaranteed quotas lacked the expertise to operate in a more flexible environment. Many managers, untrained in basic market principles, failed to adjust production to real demand. Instead of increasing efficiency, decentralization often generated confusion, as supply chains collapsed without the rigid planning mechanisms that had coordinated them, however inefficiently, for decades. The shift from fixed prices to partially market-driven prices created enormous distortions, causing some goods to skyrocket in cost while others disappeared entirely from circulation. Inflation, previously suppressed by the state, began to surface as an uncontrolled force. Savings accumulated over years lost value rapidly, and ordinary citizens found themselves with money that could buy fewer and fewer goods. Cooperatives, initially celebrated as engines of innovation, soon gained a reputation for profiteering because they charged prices aligned with supply and demand rather than state subsidies. This created a stark contrast between state wages and cooperative incomes, fostering resentment and fueling suspicion that Gorbachev's reforms were enriching a small minority while impoverishing the rest of the population. Additionally, the government struggled to collect taxes from cooperatives, draining state revenue at a time when the economy was already under immense strain. These problems were not necessarily the fault of the cooperatives themselves, but the result of a system caught between two incompatible economic models. Compounding the internal instability was the Soviet Union's deteriorating external position. Oil prices, one of the USSR's main sources of foreign currency, fell sharply during the mid-1980s, reducing the funds available to import key technologies, food supplies, and industrial equipment. Foreign debt grew, and Western governments remained cautious about offering significant financial support. Meanwhile, defense spending remained extremely high due to the continuing Cold War competition with the United States. Though Gorbachev would later sign arms reduction treaties, these diplomatic achievements came too late to ease the immediate financial pressures. The population, feeling the effects of shortages more acutely than ever before, began losing faith not only in the reforms but in the system as a whole. What had begun as a controlled restructuring spiraled into an economic crisis that threatened the very stability of the Soviet state. Recognizing that economic restructuring alone would not succeed without political renewal, Gorbachev pursued reforms aimed at transforming how power was exercised within the USSR. His goal was to energize the political system, reduce corruption, and introduce a degree of democratic accountability while still preserving the Communist Party's leading role. These reforms included creating new political institutions, allowing multi-candidate elections, and reducing the party's direct control over state governance. The establishment of the Congress of People's Deputies marked a dramatic step toward political pluralism, enabling televised debates in which delegates openly criticized government policies, questioned officials, and challenged long-standing narratives. For many Soviet citizens, watching these debates was a revelation. They saw their representatives speaking freely in ways that would have been unimaginable only a few years earlier. However, political liberalization produced consequences Gorbachev did not anticipate. By reducing the party's monopoly on power, he unintentionally legitimized broader demands for political freedom and autonomy. Reformist politicians, intellectuals, and grassroots activists seized the opportunity to push for deeper change. Boris Yeltsin emerged as a prominent figure, criticizing Gorbachev for moving too slowly and advocating for more radical democratic reforms. Meanwhile, nationalist leaders across the republics used the new political space to call for sovereignty, independence, or, at minimum, a redefinition of their relationship with Moscow. What Gorbachev viewed as constructive political competition increasingly appeared to conservatives as dangerous fragmentation. Hardliners within the party grew alarmed, believing that the reforms threatened the survival of the USSR itself. The growth of political pluralism fundamentally altered the balance of power within the Soviet Union. The Communist Party, long the unchallenged center of authority, found itself competing with emerging political factions, popular movements, and nationalist organizations. While Gorbachev hoped political openness would strengthen the unity of the state through renewed legitimacy, It instead exposed deep ideological divides and historical grievances. The reforms undermined the centralized mechanisms that had held the Union together for decades. As debates intensified and opposition expanded, it became clear that the Soviet Union was entering a phase in which maintaining control through traditional means was no longer possible. The country stood on the edge of a political transformation that would shape not just its future, but the future of global geopolitics. By the late 1980s, the socialist governments of Eastern Europe, often referred to as the Soviet satellite states, were facing mounting political and economic pressures similar to those undermining the USSR itself. For decades, their security depended on the presence and authority of the Soviet Union, which had intervened militarily in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968 to suppress reformist movements. Under Brezhnev, the message had been clear: no deviation from Moscow's control will be tolerated. However, Gorbachev's rejection of the Brezhnev Doctrine dramatically altered the geopolitical landscape. His policy of the Sinatra Doctrine, humorously nicknamed for allowing states to do it their way, signaled that the USSR would no longer use force to preserve communist regimes in Eastern Europe. While this was consistent with his ideals of reform and cooperation, it unintentionally accelerated the region's unraveling. Across Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, populations that had endured decades of one-party rule suddenly sensed an opportunity for transformation. The winds of glasnost swept over the region, emboldening activists, opposition groups, and workers' organizations that had survived in semi-clandestine form. Economic decline fed public anger. Shortages, rationing, unemployment, and decaying infrastructure turned even previously loyal citizens into critics of the system. In Poland, the Solidarity movement, long suppressed, re-emerged as a powerful political force. Hungary began quietly dismantling sections of its border fence with Austria. East German citizens expressed growing frustration with travel restrictions and state surveillance. People across the region saw Gorbachev as a symbol of hope, even when their own governments condemned him for encouraging dangerous openness. Despite the diversity of political cultures across Eastern Europe, one common thread united them: the understanding that Moscow would no longer send tanks to enforce obedience. This realization transformed passive discontent into open political challenge. Communist leaders, who had once ruled confidently under the shadow of Soviet support, now found themselves isolated, unpopular, and fearful. Their authority weakened not simply because citizens opposed them, but because the foundation of their legitimacy, backing from the USSR, had eroded. The political pressures that had been building quietly for decades now burst into the open, triggering mass demonstrations, strikes, and demands for democratic reforms. The collapse of these regimes happened more quickly than anyone anticipated, including Gorbachev himself, who hoped for gradual evolution rather than sudden revolutions. The year 1989 became one of the most transformative moments in modern European history, as a cascade of revolutions swept across the Eastern Bloc with astonishing speed and remarkably little violence. Starting in Poland, partially free elections led to a dramatic defeat for the Communist Party, opening the door to the first non-communist government in the region since World War II. The peaceful transition electrified neighboring countries. In Hungary, reformist communists and opposition leaders cooperated to dismantle the one-party system, reopen the border with Austria, and effectively create the first breach in the Iron Curtain. Thousands of East Germans used Hungary as an escape route, traveling to West Germany through Austria and demonstrating the crumbling authority of their government. as East German citizens fled or protested, the pressure on the government became unbearable. The Berlin Wall, long a symbol of division, repression, and Cold War tension, fell on November 9th, 1989, in scenes broadcast around the world. Crowds of East and West Berliners celebrated together, hammering at concrete barriers that had separated families and friends for nearly 30 years. The collapse of the Berlin Wall became the defining image of the end of the Cold War, marking not only the failure of the East German state, but the symbolic defeat of Soviet-backed communism in Europe. Czechoslovakia followed with the Velvet Revolution, a peaceful movement driven by students, intellectuals, and workers who demanded political freedom and the end of communist rule. Massive demonstrations in Prague forced the resignation of party leaders and opened the path for Václav Havel, a dissident playwright, to become president. Bulgaria saw its longtime leader Todor Zhivkov removed by his own party under pressure from public protests. Romania was the exception to the otherwise peaceful wave. The regime of Nicolae Ceausescu clung to power violently, sparking an armed uprising that ended with his execution. Even so, the pattern was clear. Without Soviet intervention, Eastern Europe was free to choose its own political course, and its people overwhelmingly chose democracy. The domino effect of 1989 astonished the world. Decades of repression collapsed within months. An entire nation's transition from authoritarian socialism to pluralistic democracy with a speed rarely seen in history. For Gorbachev, these events were bittersweet. While they aligned with his vision of a more peaceful Europe, they also weakened the Soviet Union's strategic position and encouraged similar demands within its own republics. The unraveling of the Eastern Bloc was not merely a regional shift. It was a prelude to the profound changes about to strike the USSR itself. The collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe confronted Soviet leadership with a dilemma that exposed the limits of Gorbachev's strategy. On one hand, Gorbachev believed deeply in the principles of non-intervention, political reform, and respect for national sovereignty. He wanted to end the era in which Soviet tanks enforced conformity across the region, and he understood that sustaining the Eastern Bloc through force was not only morally questionable, but economically and politically unsustainable. On the other hand, the rapid disintegration of the communist sphere undermined Soviet geopolitical influence, weakened military alliances, and raised the possibility that former allies would shift toward the West. Gorbachev faced pressure from conservative factions who accused him of relinquishing the USSR's global position and betraying socialist ideals. These tensions highlighted how difficult it was to balance reform with imperial legacy. Within the Warsaw Pact, Soviet officials increasingly realized that their presence was unwelcome. Attempts to reinforce ideological unity failed because the populations of Eastern Europe were no longer willing to accept the old political narrative. As one regime after another collapsed, it became clear that the USSR lacked not only the will, but also the capacity to intervene militarily. Its economy was faltering, its political system was in turmoil, and its own citizens were questioning the legitimacy of the party. Even if Gorbachev had desired to use force, doing so would have risked internal rebellion, international condemnation, and possibly civil war. The Soviet Union was no longer an empire capable of imposing its will. It was a superpower struggling to maintain coherence within its own borders. The fallout from the Eastern Bloc's collapse reverberated deeply inside the USSR. Nationalist movements across the Soviet republics gained new momentum, seeing the revolutions abroad as proof that oppressive systems could fall peacefully. Baltic republics like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia intensified demands for sovereignty. In Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova, calls for independence grew louder. Even within Russia, political figures such as Boris Yeltsin argued that the Union should be redefined or dissolved entirely. For many Soviet citizens, the loss of control over Eastern Europe symbolized the weakening of Moscow's authority and raised fundamental questions about the future of the Union itself. By 1990, the USSR found itself in an unprecedented position. The empire that had once dominated half of Europe was unraveling from both the outside and the inside. Gorbachev's reforms had unleashed forces that neither he nor any leader could fully contain. What began as a vision of revitalizing socialism had become a process of dismantling the geopolitical structure that had defined the Soviet Union for decades. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a dramatic sequence that would ultimately bring the USSR to its final days. By the late 1980s, nationalism, long considered one of the greatest threats to Soviet unity, began spreading rapidly through the Union's 15 republics. For decades, Moscow had attempted to suppress or tightly control national sentiment, promoting Soviet identity as the overarching identity above all others. While local languages, folklore, and traditions were permitted on a limited level, any movement that hinted at autonomy or sovereignty was swiftly crushed. However, the policies of glasnost and perestroika inadvertently loosened these restrictions, allowing republics to express long-suppressed grievances, cultural aspirations, and historical narratives that diverged sharply from the official Soviet version. As archives opened and discussions about past injustices became mainstream, communities learned or remembered episodes, mass deportations, political repression, cultural Russification that reignited a sense of collective memory and injustice. In the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the resurgence of national identity was particularly powerful because these nations had been independent states before their annexation by the USSR in 1940. Glasnost enabled historians, journalists, and activists to publicize the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which had paved the way for Soviet occupation. Citizens realized that their incorporation into the USSR had been the result of force rather than legitimate choice. This revelation turned historical grievance into political activism. Peaceful demonstrations, human chain protests, mass singing festivals, and cultural mobilization movements emerged, drawing hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of participants. People demanded not merely reform, but restoration of independence. Meanwhile, in the Caucasus, ethnic tensions intensified for different reasons. Armenians demanded control over Nagorno-Karabakh, a predominantly Armenian region placed under Azerbaijani administration during the Soviet period. Massive protests in Yerevan, counter-protests in Baku, and outbreaks of violence marked the beginnings of conflicts that Moscow struggled to contain. In Georgia, dissident movements long suppressed under Soviet rule erupted with calls for sovereignty, cultural revival, and full independence. Demonstrations in Tbilisi were met with deadly force in 1989 when Soviet troops used gas and sharpened shovels against protesters, killing and injuring dozens. Instead of restoring order, the crackdown fueled even more national determination and further eroded trust in Moscow. Central Asian republics also saw rising tensions, though often rooted in economic inequality, demographic pressures, and local governance crises rather than outright national separatism. Nonetheless, Glasnost allowed people to speak openly about environmental disasters, such as the destruction of the Aral Sea, corruption by local party elites, and the neglect of regional needs by Moscow. These grievances contributed to a broader awareness that the Soviet system did not serve all republics equally. By 1988 to 1989, Nationalism had transformed from isolated cultural movements into a powerful, organized political force. People were no longer asking for modest reforms or language rights. They were openly questioning the legitimacy of Soviet authority itself. The rise of national identity directly challenged the idea that the USSR was a unified, harmonized multinational state. As these movements gained strength, the central government faced a profound dilemma: suppress nationalism through force, risking civil war, or allow it to flourish and watch the Union unravel. The three Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, became the vanguard of the independence struggle inside the USSR, demonstrating how mass mobilization, cultural unity, and strategic political organization could defy even a superpower. Their movements were driven by a clear historical narrative. The Baltics had been sovereign states with functioning democracies before their forced annexation. This gave their independence demands not only emotional weight, but legal legitimacy. Democratic activists formed popular fronts in each republic. Sejudis in Lithuania, the Popular Front of Latvia, and the Popular Front of Estonia. These movements quickly gained broad support among citizens, ranging from intellectuals to workers, and even portions of the local communist parties began siding with the reformers rather than Moscow. One of the most extraordinary demonstrations in modern European history occurred on August 23, 1989, the Baltic Way. Approximately 2 million people joined hands to form a continuous human chain stretching over 600 kilometers across all three Baltic republics. Symbolically held on the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the event demonstrated unity, discipline, and overwhelming desire for independence. Images of the protest circulated globally, illustrating how dramatically the Soviet Empire was weakening. It was an unmistakable message to Moscow. The Baltic peoples were intent on reclaiming their freedom, and they were prepared to do so peacefully, collectively, and persistently. While their protests remained peaceful, political tensions escalated rapidly. Lithuania pushed ahead most aggressively, declaring independence in March 1990. The first Soviet republic to do so. Moscow responded with economic blockades and political pressure, hoping to force the republic back into compliance. When these measures failed, Soviet forces stormed the Vilnius TV tower in January 1991, killing unarmed civilians who had formed human shields. But instead of intimidating the population, the violence galvanized global sympathy and accelerated the push for independence. Soon after, Latvia and Estonia also declared full independence, and their local communist leaders aligned themselves with the new movements rather than the Soviet center. The Baltic example inspired republics across the USSR, proving that the Kremlin's authority was weakening and that peaceful mobilization could achieve results once considered impossible. Their success set a pattern. Legal declarations of sovereignty, mass protests, strategic nonviolence, and international diplomacy all combined to create unstoppable momentum. The Soviet Union, once thought invincible, now faced internal fragmentation driven not by foreign threats, but by the very peoples it claimed to unify. While the Baltics represented a model of disciplined, peaceful independence movements, the situation in other Soviet republics was more volatile, varied, and ultimately more difficult for Moscow to control. In the Caucasus, nationalism intertwined with deep-rooted ethnic tensions, historical grievances, and territorial disputes. Armenia's demand for the unification of Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia ignited mass demonstrations that soon spiraled into clashes, pogroms, and cycles of retaliatory violence between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. Moscow dispatched troops repeatedly, but found that its interventions often inflamed tensions rather than resolving them. The Soviet state, which once prided itself on managing multinational harmony, now appeared incapable of restoring peace in regions where distrust ran deep. Georgia experienced its own surge of nationalism, fueled by cultural revival, historical memory, and widespread resentment of Soviet rule. The deadly crackdown on peaceful protesters in Tbilisi in April 1989 marked a turning point. It convinced many Georgians that coexistence within the USSR was impossible. This event radicalized the independence movement, leading to growing demands for secession and the rise of leaders such as Zviad Gamsakhurdia, who openly challenged Moscow. In neighboring republics like Moldova, protests emerged against Russification policies and in favor of cultural and linguistic revival, eventually pushing the republic toward its own declaration of sovereignty. Ukraine, the second largest Soviet republic and a key pillar of the Union, experienced a gradual but profound national awakening. Environmental activism after the Chernobyl disaster, cultural revitalization, and growing distrust of the central government fed into increasingly vocal demands for sovereignty. Intellectuals, miners, students, and local politicians all contributed to a rising national consciousness that positioned Ukraine not as a regional territory within the USSR, but as a nation with its own destiny. By 1990, mass protests such as the Student Revolution on Granite in Kiev signaled that Ukrainians were prepared to challenge Moscow's authority. Central Asian republics also faced mounting tensions, although most did not initially seek full independence. Growing demographic pressures, political corruption, and resentment toward Moscow's economic policies provoked unrest. Violent incidents in Kazakhstan in 1986 and in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan during the late 1980s revealed the fragility of the Soviet state's control over its vast, diverse territories. Even in Russia, the core republic of the USSR, new political forces led by Boris Yeltsin began advocating for sovereignty, effectively rejecting the supremacy of the Moscow-based Union institutions. By 1990 to 1991, nearly every Soviet republic had adopted declarations of sovereignty or outright independence. The rise of nationalism was no longer a series of isolated movements, but a continent-wide transformation. The Soviet Union, conceived as a multinational federation held together by ideology and centralized authority, now confronted the ultimate contradiction of its existence. Once Republican identities were allowed to flourish, the Union itself became unsustainable. The political forces unleashed by Glasnost had evolved into demands that could no longer be contained through persuasion, reform, or force. The stage was set for the final crisis of the Soviet state. Boris Yeltsin's rise within the late Soviet political landscape marked one of the most dramatic transformations in the final years of the USSR. Initially a loyal member of the Communist Party, Yeltsin built his career through regional leadership roles, eventually becoming the party chief of Moscow, a position that allowed him to witness firsthand the disconnect between official ideology and the lived reality of Soviet citizens. In Moscow, he encountered rampant corruption, entrenched bureaucracy, and a stale political culture resistant to reform. His attempts to modernize the city's administration, reduce privileges for elite officials, and improve living conditions won him popularity among ordinary citizens, but earned him fierce opposition from the political establishment. Over time, Yeltsin's frustration with the party's resistance to genuine change deepened, pushing him toward more confrontational positions. His public break with the Communist Party leadership came in 1987 during a dramatic session of the Central Committee. Yeltsin criticized the pace of perestroika, the hypocrisy of high-ranking officials, and the party's reluctance to allow democratic participation. In the hierarchical world of Soviet politics, such open criticism was unprecedented. Conservative members of the Politburo considered his speech an act of betrayal, leading to his demotion and political humiliation. Yet instead of ending his career, the incident transformed Yeltsin into a symbol of honesty and defiance. Ordinary people who felt alienated by the sluggish pace of reform admired his willingness to challenge entrenched power. As glasnost expanded the space for open discussion, Yeltsin's public image grew stronger. He increasingly became a figure who embodied the frustrations of a society yearning for more radical change. The more Gorbachev tried to balance between conservatives and reformists, the more Yeltsin positioned himself as the voice of the dissatisfied majority. He embraced the emerging democratic movements sweeping through the republics and advocated for political pluralism, market reforms, and greater autonomy for Russia within the increasingly fragile Union. In 1989, Yeltsin won a seat in the Congress of People's Deputies with overwhelming support, demonstrating his popularity among voters. Televised debates allowed him to reach millions, and his speeches often resonated more strongly than the cautious language of official reformers. By 1990, Yeltsin formally resigned from the Communist Party, declaring its monopoly on power incompatible with democratic development. This bold act shocked the political elite and electrified the public. His departure symbolized a broader collapse of faith in the party and accelerated the shift toward a political landscape where multiple voices, not just the communist hierarchy, could shape the future. For many Soviet citizens, Yeltsin represented a new kind of leader, outspoken, imperfect, emotional, but undeniably committed to dismantling old systems that no longer worked. His break with the establishment would go on to reshape not only Russia's destiny, but also the fate of the entire Soviet Union. The significance of Russia's sovereignty movement cannot be overstated. For decades, Russia had been the backbone of the Soviet system, economically, militarily, and ideologically. If Lithuania, Georgia, or Armenia declared sovereignty, the Union was weakened but still intact. But if Russia challenged the center, the entire structure risked collapse. Yeltsin used this reality to expand his power base, appealing to ordinary Russians who were fed up with shortages, inflation, and political paralysis. He accused the Soviet leadership of failing to protect citizens' interests and framed sovereignty as a necessary step toward reform and recovery. Strikes by miners in Siberia and the Donbass further boosted his political strength, as workers viewed him as more responsive to their grievances than Gorbachev. Tensions between the Russian parliament and the Soviet government intensified throughout 1990 and 1991. Competing laws, competing budgets, and competing narratives emerged, creating a dual power situation reminiscent of historical periods of instability. While Gorbachev attempted to negotiate a new Union treaty to preserve the Federation, Yeltsin increasingly signaled that Russia reserved the right to act independently. By mid-1991, the political center of gravity within the USSR had shifted. Moscow was still the capital, but its authority was now split between two leaders, Gorbachev as president of the Soviet Union and Yeltsin as the rising president of Russia. The conflict between them would become one of the decisive forces driving the USSR toward its final collapse. The turning point in the power struggle between Gorbachev and Yeltsin came in June 1991, when Boris Yeltsin won the first ever popular election for the presidency of Russia. His victory was decisive. He received over 57% of the vote nationwide, and it signaled far more than personal popularity. It represented the emergence of a new, democratically elected authority that directly challenged the legitimacy of the Soviet system. While Gorbachev had been appointed by the Communist Party and later confirmed through limited political mechanisms, Yeltsin's mandate came directly from tens of millions of voters. The symbolism was powerful. The people of Russia had chosen Yeltsin as their leader at a moment when the Soviet state was fighting for survival. Yeltsin's election transformed him into a political force that Gorbachev could no longer ignore or marginalize. His presidency gave him control over Russian institutions, including the police, economic ministries, and administrative structures that were previously subordinate to all union bodies. He used this power to assert increasing independence for Russia, signing decrees that contradicted Soviet laws and building alliances with leaders of other republics who also sought greater autonomy. In doing so, he positioned himself not just as a reformer, but as the architect of a post-Soviet political order. His rhetoric emphasized democracy, market transformation, and the right of republics to self-determination, ideas that resonated with populations disillusioned by years of economic crisis and unfulfilled promises of perestroika. Gorbachev, meanwhile, found himself trapped between conservatives who accused him of destroying the Union and reformers who believed he was obstructing progress. The more he tried to balance these forces, the weaker his position became. Yeltsin capitalized on this weakness, criticizing the central government's failure to resolve shortages, stabilize the economy, or stop nationalist conflicts. While Gorbachev sought compromise, Yeltsin embraced confrontation. The rivalry between them turned into a defining feature of the USSR's final years, shaping public opinion and influencing the actions of political factions across the Union. By the summer of 1991, the political landscape had been transformed. Yeltsin was now the most powerful elected official in the Soviet Union, a populist figure whose legitimacy surpassed that of the official Soviet leadership. His authority and boldness would soon be tested in the most dramatic political crisis of the era, the August 1991 coup attempt, where his response would determine not only his own legacy, but the fate of the Soviet state itself. By mid-1991, the Soviet Union was facing a level of instability unmatched since World War II. Economic collapse had accelerated, inflation spiraled, shelves were emptier than ever, and public confidence in the central government reached historic lows. Nationalist movements grew stronger across the republics, and the authority of Moscow weakened with each passing month. Conservative members of the Communist Party, military leadership, and the KGB watched these developments with growing alarm. To them, perestroika had spiraled far beyond its original intent and evolved into a force dismantling the state they had devoted their lives to defending. Many believed the only way to save the Soviet Union was to stop Gorbachev, reverse reforms, restore strict centralized control, and suppress movements for independence. These hardliners saw Gorbachev as a man who had lost control, not a reformer, but a destroyer of the socialist state. The immediate trigger for their action was the pending New Union Treaty, scheduled to be signed in August 1991. This treaty would transform the Soviet Union into a looser federation, granting sovereignty and significant autonomy to the republics. To conservatives, the treaty was nothing short of national suicide. They feared it would fatally weaken Moscow's authority and accelerate the USSR's dissolution. The leaders most opposed to the treaty included Gennady Yanev, vice president, Boris Pugo, interior minister, Dmitry Yazov, defense minister, Valentin Pavlov, prime minister, and KGB chairman Vladimir Kryukov. They were joined by other senior officials desperate to preserve the old order. These men formed the State Committee on the State of Emergency, GKCHP, a self-appointed body that intended to seize power and suspend reforms. In early August, the conspirators began coordinating their moves. Their plan was simple: isolate Gorbachev at his Crimean residence, cut him off from communication, and announce that he was unable to perform his duties due to an alleged illness. In his place, they would form an emergency government, impose martial law, control the media, and re-establish central authority. Tanks and troops will be deployed across Moscow and other major cities to intimidate opposition and prevent demonstrations. The coup was designed to appear legal, decisive, and orderly, a disciplined act to save the motherland. But beneath the surface, cracks emerged even before the coup began. The hardliners lacked charisma, unity, and the public legitimacy needed to marshal popular support. They underestimated the degree to which society had changed under Glasnost. Millions of citizens were no longer afraid to speak out. They also failed to understand the resolve of Boris Yeltsin, whose newly elected position as president of Russia gave him both political legitimacy and mass popular support. Despite their extensive planning, the conspirators were preparing to initiate a coup in a nation that had grown far less obedient, far more skeptical, and far more determined to shape its own future. When they moved against Gorbachev on August 18, 1991, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Soviet Union. The coup plotters hoped to preserve the USSR through force. Instead, their actions would accelerate its final collapse. On the morning of August 19, 1991, millions of Soviet citizens awoke to emergency broadcasts on state television announcing that President Mikhail Gorbachev was unable to perform his duties due to health reasons. The GKCHB declared a state of emergency and announced that it was now taking control of the country. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Military vehicles surrounded key government buildings, and armored columns rumbled toward strategic checkpoints. The conspirators expected the display of force to shock the country into submission. But instead of calming the situation, their announcement sounded vague, suspicious, and weak. People quickly realized something was deeply wrong. While Gorbachev remained isolated in Crimea, Boris Yeltsin was free and ready to act. Learning of the coup, he rushed to the Russian White House, the seat of Russia's parliament. Instead of hiding or fleeing, Yeltsin positioned himself as the central figure of resistance. Surrounded by supporters, he climbed onto a tank outside the White House and delivered a defiant speech denouncing the coup as unconstitutional. Images and footage of Yeltsin standing atop the tank would become iconic symbols of courage and democratic resistance. He called on citizens to strike, refuse orders from the GKCHB, and protect Russian democratic institutions. His boldness inspired crowds to form human barricades, building defensive lines of buses, cars, and improvised fortifications around the parliament building. The GKCHB attempted to impose media silence, but Glasnost had fundamentally changed the information landscape. Journalists, protesters, and sympathetic military officers circumvented censorship. Leaflets were printed, underground radio stations broadcast updates, and thousands rallied in the streets. Even within the military, confusion spread. Many officers privately sympathized with Yeltsin or believed the coup was illegal. Others simply did not want to turn their guns on civilians. When elite paratrooper units were ordered to storm the White House, their commanders refused, stating they would not fire on unarmed citizens. Meanwhile, the coup leaders held a disastrous press conference that revealed their profound incompetence. Yaniev's visibly shaking hands, awkward answers, and nervous demeanor conveyed uncertainty rather than strength. The conspirators, despite controlling tanks, troops, and state media, failed to project authority. Their indecision emboldened the resistance. Tens of thousands of people gathered around the White House, prepared to defend it at any cost. Demonstrators stayed overnight despite cold rain, convinced that the future of their country depended on their presence. Over the next 48 hours, the coup unraveled. Truppe morale collapsed. Commanders hesitated. Ordinary citizens continued mass demonstrations. Yeltsin issued decrees invalidating the GKCH peace actions, and leaders of other republics voiced support for him rather than the plotters. By August 21st, the coup collapsed entirely. Gorbachev returned to Moscow. The GKCHP leaders were arrested, and the world watched as Soviet hardliners suffered an extraordinary political defeat. But although the coup had failed, it fatally damaged the Soviet Union's remaining legitimacy. The final unraveling was now unstoppable. The collapse of the August coup was celebrated across the Soviet Union and around the world as a victory for democracy and popular resistance. Citizens who had faced down tanks with their bodies were hailed as heroes. Yeltsin emerged as the undisputed leader of the anti-coup movement, and by extension, the political figure who now commanded the greatest authority in the country. Gorbachev returned to Moscow expecting to resume leadership, but the political landscape he re-entered was radically transformed. The coup had exposed the deep flaws within his administration, demonstrated the limits of his control, and eroded whatever confidence remained in the Central Soviet government. One of the most significant consequences of the failed coup was the rapid acceleration of independence movements across the Soviet republics. Having seen that Moscow could no longer enforce unity even with tanks and troops, republics concluded that the Union had effectively collapsed in practice. Within days, Estonia and Latvia declared full independence. Lithuania, which had already done so, solidified its position. Ukraine moved toward a referendum on independence. Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova pushed forward with their own national agendas. Even republics once considered firmly integrated, such as Belarus and Kazakhstan, began distancing themselves from Moscow's authority. The center was dissolving in real time. Meanwhile, within Russia itself, Yeltsin moved swiftly to consolidate power. He banned the Communist Party from operating on Russian territory, seizing its property and archives. He placed Russian institutions above Soviet ones, effectively reducing Gorbachev to a symbolic figure with diminishing influence. The Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian governments began considering the possibility of replacing the Soviet Union with a new, independent framework. While Gorbachev attempted to salvage a reformed union through negotiation, the momentum had shifted permanently toward dissolution. The collapse of the August coup was celebrated across the Soviet Union and around the world as a victory for democracy and popular resistance. Citizens who had faced down tanks with their bodies were hailed as heroes. Yeltsin emerged as the undisputed leader of the anti-coup movement, and by extension, the political figure who now commanded the greatest authority in the country. Gorbachev returned to Moscow expecting to resume leadership, but the political landscape he re-entered was radically transformed. The coup had exposed the deep flaws within his administration, demonstrated the limits of his control, and eroded whatever confidence remained in the Central Soviet government. One of the most significant consequences of the failed coup was the rapid acceleration of independence movements across the Soviet republics. Having seen that Moscow could no longer enforce unity even with tanks and troops, republics concluded that the Union had effectively collapsed in practice. Within days, Estonia and Latvia declared full independence. Lithuania, which had already done so, solidified its position. Ukraine moved toward a referendum on independence. Georgia, Armenia, and Moldova pushed forward with their own national agendas. Even republics once considered firmly integrated, such as Belarus and Kazakhstan, began distancing themselves from Moscow's authority. The center was dissolving in real time. Meanwhile, within Russia itself, Yeltsin moved swiftly to consolidate power. He banned the Communist Party from operating on Russian territory, seizing its property and archives. He placed Russian institutions above Soviet ones, effectively reducing Gorbachev to a symbolic figure with diminishing influence. The Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian governments began considering the possibility of replacing the Soviet Union with a new, independent framework. While Gorbachev attempted to salvage a reformed union through negotiation, the momentum had shifted permanently toward dissolution. The failed coup also shattered the morale of Soviet institutions, particularly the military and KGB. Thousands of officers felt betrayed by their own leadership, confused about their role, and skeptical of the future. Many resigned or shifted their loyalty to Republican authorities. State media, once rigidly controlled, now spoke openly about corruption, incompetence, and the failures of the Communist Party. The ideological foundation of USSR had crumbled. A system built on certainty, discipline, and centralized power was left exposed as fragile, divided, and unable to command obedience. By late 1991, it was clear that the August coup did not save the Soviet Union. It destroyed the last possibility of preserving it. The coup had intended to restore the old system, but instead proved that the old system had already died. The USSR now moved toward its final chapter, driven by republics ready to declare independence and leaders determined to build new states from the ruins of the old Union. The end was no longer a distant threat. It was imminent, irreversible, and rapidly approaching. The failure of the August 1991 coup attempt marked a decisive turning point in the history of the Soviet Union. In the days immediately following the coup's collapse, the political atmosphere across the republics changed with breathtaking speed. For years, independence movements had struggled against the authority of Moscow, dealing with threats, negotiations, half-promises, and occasional violence. But the coup shattered the illusion that the central government still had the capacity to enforce unity. To many citizens of the republics, the events of August 19th to 21st proved that the Soviet state was hollow, divided, and incapable of maintaining control without resorting to desperate measures. And when those measures failed, the system's legitimacy evaporated almost overnight. Republic after republic seized the opportunity. Estonia and Latvia formally restored full independence within hours of the coup's collapse. Lithuania, which had already declared independence in 1990, gained universal diplomatic recognition as Moscow's ability to resist crumbled. In Ukraine, the Supreme Soviet passed a historic declaration of independence on August 24th, 1991. This was not merely a symbolic act. It was an unequivocal political break that marked one of the most significant geopolitical changes of the era. Ukraine, with its population, its resources, its military assets, and its historical weight, was central to the Soviet Union's identity. Many analysts understood that without Ukraine, the USSR could not possibly survive. Across the Caucasus, the momentum spread with equal force. Georgia, whose independence movement had already intensified after the deadly 1989 crackdown in Tbilisi, accelerated its departure from the Union. Armenia, embroiled in conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, saw independence not merely as a political aspiration, but as a necessity for survival. Azerbaijan, facing its own internal and regional pressures, followed a similar path. Even republics once regarded as more cautious or closely tied to Soviet structures, such as Belarus and Moldova, began distancing themselves rapidly. Moldova moved to reassert its Romanian language identity and rejected Soviet centralism. Belarus declared sovereignty and began taking steps to loosen political ties with Moscow. Central Asian republics, which had historically been less confrontational towards Soviet power, initially hesitated. But the coup's failure made it clear that remaining part of a collapsing state carried enormous risks. Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan followed one another in declaring sovereignty or outright independence, although their motivations varied. Ranging from economic survival to political opportunity, the outcome was the same. The Soviet Union was dissolving from every direction. In many places, citizens celebrated independence with relief and pride. In others, confusion and uncertainty dominated. But regardless of the emotional tone, the political reality was unmistakable. A union once held together by ideology, force, and centralized control was now disintegrating under the weight of its own contradictions and the unstoppable momentum of national self-determination. Among all the republics seeking independence, Ukraine carried unique historical, cultural, and political significance. Its population of over 50 million, its vast territory, its cultural diversity, and its industrial and agricultural resources made it an indispensable part of the Soviet framework. Historically, Russian and Soviet leaders had considered Ukraine not merely a republic, but a core part of the nation's identity, the sister republic, whose departure was unthinkable. Yet as political turmoil intensified and the Soviet government lost credibility, Ukrainian society gravitated toward the idea that only full sovereignty could guarantee stability, democracy, and national revival. This sentiment culminated in a historic referendum held on December 1st, 1991, in which citizens were asked a direct question. Did they support Ukraine's independence? The results were overwhelming. More than 84% of eligible voters participated, and over 90% voted in favor of independence. Importantly, the yes vote was not limited to Western regions, traditionally known for strong nationalist sentiment. Even heavily Russified regions, such as Kharkiv, Odessa, and Dnipropetrovsk, supported independence by large margins. Crimea, with its Russian-majority population, registered a majority vote for independence as well. The referendum demonstrated something that stunned international observers and Soviet leaders alike. The desire for independence was a unifying force across nearly all segments of Ukrainian society. The referendum removed any remaining ambiguity. Ukraine's declaration of independence was not simply the decision of political elites. It reflected the clear, democratic will of the Ukrainian people. The global impact of this vote was immediate and profound. Western nations, which had cautiously monitored developments in the USSR, now recognized that the Soviet Union's dissolution was inevitable and irreversible. World leaders rapidly moved to recognize Ukraine as an independent state. Even Russia, led by Boris Yeltsin, accepted the outcome, understanding that opposing Ukrainian independence would lead to instability, conflict, and damage to international credibility. For the Soviet central government, the referendum delivered a devastating blow. Without Ukraine, any plan to preserve a reformed union or create a new political framework became impossible. Economically, militarily, and politically, the departure of Ukraine meant the end of the Soviet Union as a functioning geopolitical entity. The magnitude of Ukraine's choice reverberated far beyond the region. It redefined the future of Eastern Europe, altered the balance of power on the continent, and set the stage for new political, cultural, and diplomatic dynamics that would shape the post-Cold War era. The referendum represented not only a national awakening, but also a turning point in modern history. It was the moment when the Soviet Union's survival ceased to be a theoretical debate and became an impossibility. Ukraine's people, through democratic expression, had reshaped the fate of a superpower. By the final months of 1991, the Soviet Union existed more on paper than in reality. The central government in Moscow still operated, and Gorbachev still held the title of president of the USSR. But the institutions that once formed the backbone of the Union had lost their authority. The Communist Party had been banned in Russia. Republics managed their own economies, passed their own laws, and controlled their own internal affairs. Military units stationed across the republics increasingly obeyed local authorities rather than commands from the Soviet General Staff. Even the Soviet Parliament, once a symbol of centralized rule, struggled to function as its members openly questioned whether the institution still served any purpose. Economically, the situation grew increasingly dire. Markets were chaotic, inflation soared, and shortages of basic goods worsened. With republics asserting sovereignty, supply chains that once depended on centralized planning fractured. Factories lacked raw materials, and consumers faced even more uncertainty. Politically, the structure of the Union was breaking down in slow motion. Republics refused to pay taxes to the central government. Ministries increasingly operated independently or shut down entirely. Diplomatic missions abroad faced confusion over whom they represented. Even symbols of the state, flags, emblems, slogans, were replaced across the republics with astonishing speed. By November, it was clear that Gorbachev's efforts to negotiate a new federation or confederation were futile. Most republics saw no reason to rejoin a union that had already collapsed. For many of them, independence was already a lived reality. The final act came not through war or revolution, but through political negotiation among the leaders of the largest republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. These leaders, including Russia's Yeltsin, Ukraine's newly elected President Leonid Kravchuk, and Belarus's Stanislav Shushkevich, understood that the structure of the USSR no longer existed in practice. They met quietly to determine how to formalize the end of the Union in a peaceful, coordinated manner. As December 1991 approached, the world watched with a mixture of astonishment and anticipation. A state that had once dominated global politics, shaped international affairs, and commanded vast military power was dissolving without large-scale violence or civil war. An outcome few would have predicted during the darkest days of the Cold War. The question was no longer whether the USSR would collapse, but how and when its dissolution would be officially declared. The answer would come in a secluded forest in Belarus, where leaders of the Slavic republics would write the final chapter of Soviet history. In early December 1991, the leaders of the three Slavic republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, found themselves at the center of a historic moment. These republics had once formed the core of the Soviet Union, providing the bulk of its population, economy, and cultural identity. Russia, the largest and most influential. Ukraine, the powerful industrial and agricultural heartland. And Belarus, strategically located between East and West. Together, they represented the foundation on which the USSR had been built. After decades of centralized rule and months of political disintegration, it became clear to the leaders of these republics that the Soviet Union no longer functioned as a cohesive state. Independence movements had surged everywhere, and the failed August coup had shattered Moscow's ability to govern. Yet the question remained: how could the USSR be brought to a peaceful, legal, and internationally recognized end? To address this question, Russian President Boris Yeltsin, Ukrainian President Leonid Kravchuk, and Belarusian leader Stanislav Shushkevich arranged a discreet meeting in a government hunting lodge deep in the Belovezha forest of Belarus. The location was chosen for its isolation, away from Moscow's influence and the watchful eyes of political factions that might try to interfere. Accompanied by a small number of advisors, the leaders arrived on December 7th, 1991. Their objective was not merely to discuss the political crisis, but potentially to make a decision that would change the course of world history. The atmosphere inside the lodge was tense yet pragmatic. All three leaders understood that the Soviet Union had ceased functioning as a union in reality. Republics operated independently. The Soviet government had no meaningful control, and the people of Ukraine had just overwhelmingly voted for full independence. Yet formally dissolving a superpower that had existed for nearly 7 decades required boldness, legal clarity, and coordination. Yeltsin approached the meeting with a clear agenda. He believed Russia should no longer be bound by the collapsing Soviet structures. Kravchuk represented a nation that had just expressed its democratic will for sovereignty, and he had no mandate to negotiate Ukraine back into any kind of union. Shushkevich, though leading a smaller republic, played a crucial role as mediator, helping the discussions remain focused and constructive. Over hours of intense conversation, the leaders examined the realities facing them. They understood that without cooperation, the collapse of the USSR could lead to chaos. Disputed borders, contested military assets, economic paralysis, and even armed conflict. The central government in Moscow was paralyzed, the economy was failing, and the military was uncertain about its chain of command. By working together, they sought to create an orderly transition that would prevent turmoil. On December 8th, 1991, the three leaders reached a decisive conclusion. The Soviet Union could no longer exist. It was not being overthrown. It had dissolved through political, economic, and legal disintegration. All that remained was to acknowledge this reality in a formal document that would reshape the map of the world. The decision to dissolve the Soviet Union was codified in a historic document known as the Belovezh Accords. Formally titled the Agreement on the Creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CS, it declared without ambiguity that the USSR as a geopolitical and legal entity had ceased to exist. This single sentence carried immense weight. It legally terminated one of the world's most powerful states, a superpower with nuclear weapons, enormous territory, global alliances, and decades of influence in international affairs. The agreement contained several key points. First, it affirmed that the Soviet Union's existence was over. Second, it established the CS, a loose confederation that would allow former republics to cooperate economically and politically without the coercive mechanisms of the old Soviet system. Third, it sought to ensure a peaceful transition. Military structures, particularly control over nuclear weapons, required coordination to prevent instability. The leaders agreed that Russia, as the largest successor state, would assume command of the nuclear arsenal while committing to international safety protocols. Fourth, the document emphasized mutual respect for sovereignty, border integrity, and cooperation among the newly independent states. After hours of final revisions, the leaders signed the accords on December 8th, 1991. Photographs of the moment show a calm but serious atmosphere. Three men who understood that they were ending not just a state, but an era. They openly stated that they had not destroyed the Soviet Union, but had merely recognized that it no longer existed in practice. The agreement was faxed to Moscow, and when Gorbachev received the news, he was stunned. As president of the USSR, he was now leader of a state that had effectively been abolished without his involvement. The Belovezh Accords were a geopolitical earthquake. Once the document became public, shockwaves rippled across the world. Western nations, though surprised by the speed of events, largely welcomed the peaceful nature of the dissolution. Former Soviet republics reacted with varied emotions: celebration, relief, confusion, anxiety. In Russia, reactions were mixed. Some saw it as liberation, others as a tragic loss. In Ukraine and the Baltics, the Accords were hailed as confirmation of their long-sought independence. Across Central Asia and the Caucasus, leaders rushed to determine how their republics would integrate into the new framework. Despite criticism from some political factions, the Accords held firm. Within days, the agreement was recognized by the majority of the republics, and the CIS began to take shape. The world had changed in a matter of hours. A superpower that had once stretched across 11 time zones, defined the Cold War, and dominated global politics had been formally dissolved not through war or revolution, but through signatures on a document in a forest lodge. When Mikhail Gorbachev learned that the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus had signed the Belaviza Accords, he reacted with disbelief and anger. From his perspective, the agreement was not simply a political decision. It was an assault on the legal framework of the Soviet state and on his own authority as president. Gorbachev had spent years attempting to reform the Union, envisioning a new federation that would balance Republican autonomy with central coordination. He believed the USSR could survive in a revised democratic form. The Belaviza Declaration shattered that vision in an instant. Gorbachev attempted to challenge the legality of the Accords, arguing that the leaders had exceeded their authority. He made urgent phone calls, wrote statements, and tried to rally political institutions, but his efforts were largely ignored. The Supreme Soviet of Russia quickly ratified the agreement, effectively confirming Russia's exit from the USSR. Ukrainian and Belarusian institutions did the same. Without the participation of the three largest Slavic republics, the Soviet Union had no legal or practical foundation to continue. The army, once the backbone of Soviet power, did not intervene. The KGB remained passive. The Communist Party, already weakened and banned in several republics, had no capacity to respond. Gorbachev was increasingly isolated, a president without a country. As December progressed, momentum toward final dissolution intensified. On December 21st, 11 former Soviet republics met in Alma-Ata, Almaty, and formally confirmed that the Soviet Union no longer existed, expanding the CS to include Central Asian and Caucasus states. They issued the Alma-Ata Protocol, which reaffirmed the Belaviza Accords and extended the CS to most of the former Soviet territory. Even republics that were hesitant to leave now recognized that there was no union left to remain in. Realizing that his presidency had become symbolic, Gorbachev prepared his resignation. On December 25, 1991, he delivered a televised address acknowledging the end of the Soviet Union. Behind him, the Soviet flag, red with a hammer and sickle, still hung, but it was the last time it would appear in an official capacity. His tone was calm, reflective, and tinged with sorrow. He spoke about the achievements and mistakes of the Soviet era, the hopes for democracy, and a need for peaceful international relations. That evening, the Soviet flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the final time and replaced by the tricolor flag of the Russian Federation. The next day, December 26, 1991, the Soviet of the republics formally voted the USSR out of existence. A state that had shaped the 20th century had vanished. The Cold War was over. A new geopolitical era had begun. By December 1991, the Soviet government existed more as a shell than a functioning authority. Ministries that had once commanded vast bureaucracies and controlled every aspect of life, industry, agriculture, education, foreign relations, internal security, found their power evaporating day by day. The republics had seized their own institutions. Regional leaders no longer obeyed orders from Moscow. Even within the bureaucracy itself, officials openly questioned whether the central government still had any legitimate role. Offices that once processed thousands of directives a week now operated like ghost structures. Phones rang unanswered, files were abandoned, and previously feared officials found themselves irrelevant in the new political reality. The Soviet Parliament, the Supreme Soviet, struggled to meet as its members debated whether they represented a country that no longer existed. Many deputies left Moscow to return to their newly independent republics, where local governments required immediate support to build new administrative systems. Ministries such as Foreign Affairs, Defense, and Finance confronted unprecedented chaos. Diplomats stationed abroad questioned their allegiance. Should they represent the USSR, Russia, or the republic from which they originated? The military faced similar uncertainty. Soviet armed forces were stationed across all 15 republics. Yet now those republics claimed sovereignty over their territory. Commanders waited for clear orders that never came. Units in Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic states, and Central Asia received conflicting commands from Moscow and local governments. Some groups pledged loyalty to their republics. Others hesitated, unsure which authority would endure. For Gorbachev, the disintegration of the state he led was deeply personal. Having dedicated his political life to reforming the Union, he watched helplessly as the institutions he sought to modernize collapsed faster than he could react. His appeals for unity and negotiation fell on deaf ears. The republics were no longer interested in compromise. Even Russia, the core of the Soviet project, under Yeltsin's leadership, acted independently and aggressively dismantled the mechanisms of the old state. Gorbachev found himself increasingly isolated, not by force, but by political irrelevance. As the final days approached, the Kremlin itself began preparing for transition. Offices were cleared, files archived or removed, and staff members quietly shifted their loyalties to the emerging Russian state. The symbolic heart of the Soviet government, once bustling with activity and guarded authority, now felt strangely empty. Guards still stood watch, interiors remained lit, and ceremonies continued in diminished form, but the atmosphere was heavy with awareness that an era was ending. The world's first socialist state, built on revolutionary ideology and maintained through immense centralized power, was dissolving without resistance. It was a peaceful collapse, not through surrender, but through abandonment. The Soviet government did not fall. It simply faded as its constituent parts walked away. As the Soviet Union dissolved, the Russian Federation emerged rapidly as the legal, political, and administrative successor state. Historically, Russia had been the dominant partner within the USSR, contributing the bulk of its territory, population, military, and economic power. In the post-Soviet landscape, Russia stepped into a new identity, not as the center of an empire, but as an independent nation-state responsible for navigating a radically changed world. The transition was both immediate and complex. Boris Yeltsin, as the first democratically elected president of Russia, became the central figure in managing this transformation. A key part of Russia's new role involved assuming control of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, with thousands of nuclear warheads spread across several republics, notably Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The prospect of uncontrolled or contested weapons alarmed the global community. To ensure international stability, Yeltsin negotiated agreements whereby Russia would become the sole nuclear successor state. In exchange, the other republics received security assurances, economic cooperation, and diplomatic support for their own nation building. This arrangement helped prevent the collapse of the USSR from sparking a proliferation crisis, marking one of the most important diplomatic achievements of the transition. Economically, Russia faced enormous challenges. The Soviet system had collapsed without leaving behind a functioning market economy. Much of the country's industry depended on centrally planned production networks that no longer existed. Ministries responsible for coordinating supply chains across the republics had vanished, and Russia now had to redesign its economic foundation virtually from scratch. Yeltsin's government introduced radical market reforms, privatization, price liberalization, currency restructuring, hoping to create a capitalist economy overnight. These reforms would later lead to severe hardship, but at the time, they were seen as the only way to avoid complete economic paralysis. Politically, Russia inherited the Soviet Union's place on the global stage. It took over the USSR's seat on the United Nations Security Council, its embassies worldwide, and its diplomatic agreements. Internationally, the transition was mostly smooth as world leaders recognized the necessity of maintaining diplomatic continuity. Domestically, however, the shift created considerable internal debate. Citizens were divided. Some celebrated the newfound freedom and sovereignty, while others mourned the loss of superpower identity. Yeltsin positioned himself as a reformer leading Russia toward democracy, though his authority, methods, and policies would soon face intense scrutiny. Despite the uncertainty and instability, one thing became clear. Russia was now the principal successor to the Soviet state, bearing both the burdens and opportunities of that historic inheritance. The Soviet Union had vanished, but its legacy lived on in the institutions, territories, and political identity of the Russian Federation. The transition marked the beginning of a new chapter, one defined not by superpower ideology, but by the challenges of building a modern nation in the aftermath of empire. The dissolution of the Soviet Union reverberated across the world with profound geopolitical consequences. For decades, global politics have been defined by the rivalry between the United States and the USSR. The Cold War shaped military alliances, economic systems, diplomatic relationships, and ideological battles across continents. The sudden disappearance of one of the two superpowers created a new international landscape, one filled with uncertainty, opportunity, and significant long-term repercussions. In the West, especially in the United States and Europe, the end of the Soviet Union was met with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. The collapse appeared to confirm the triumph of liberal democracy and market capitalism. Leaders celebrated the peaceful end of the Cold War and anticipated an era of cooperation, reduced military tensions, and expanded international trade. NATO began redefining itself for the post-Cold War world, and discussions emerged about expanding democratic institutions eastward. Yet beneath this optimism lay concerns about nuclear security, regional instability, and the economic collapse spreading across the former Soviet space. In Asia, China observed the dissolution with particular interest and concern. The fall of the USSR reinforced to Chinese leadership that rapid political liberalization could destabilize a socialist state. Chinese officials used the Soviet example as justification for maintaining tight political control even as they pursued economic reforms. In the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America, nations that had relied on Soviet support for military, economic, or ideological reasons found themselves navigating a new global reality. Some governments lost critical backing, while others shifted toward Western partnerships. Former Soviet republics faced the immediate task of nation building, creating constitutions, establishing legal systems, forming new militaries, developing independent economies and defining foreign policies. Some took pro-Western paths, others aligned closely with Russia. Many struggled with internal conflicts, ethnic divisions, or territorial disputes that had been suppressed under Soviet rule. The world's largest geopolitical space now contained 15 new states, each with its own challenges and ambitions. Economically, the collapse triggered a major shock across global markets. Supply chains that once depended on Soviet industrial output collapsed. Former Soviet citizens faced unemployment, inflation, poverty, and dramatic declines in living standards. International organizations such as the IMF and World Bank intervened with loans, advice, and structural adjustment programs, policies that would shape the political and economic development of the region for decades. The Cold War was over, but its legacy persisted. The balance of power shifted dramatically, creating a unipolar world dominated by the United States. Russia began redefining its identity, oscillating between partnership with the West and reassertion of geopolitical influence. Many of the tensions that emerged in the post-Soviet space would later shape 21st century geopolitics, including conflicts, alliances, and the struggle for regional power. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not just an internal political transformation. It reshaped the entire global order. The world that emerged after 1991 was profoundly different from the one that had existed for nearly half a century. The consequences, economic, political, social, continue to influence global affairs today. The Soviet planned economy, once presented as a model of centralized efficiency and ideological superiority, experienced catastrophic breakdown during its final years. For decades, the USSR had relied on a rigid command system where production quotas were dictated from the top, prices were fixed, and supply chains were orchestrated through massive bureaucratic ministries. The entire system depended on centralized coordination. Factories needed raw materials shipped from distant republics. Farms relied on state-issued equipment and supplies, and retail networks distributed goods according to predetermined numbers rather than consumer demand. This structure was always fragile, but it had functioned during periods of abundant resources or strong political control. Once political authority weakened, the command economy began to collapse like a house of cards. By the late 1980s, perestroika had exposed the inefficiencies that had long been hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy. Reforms designed to give enterprises autonomy created confusion rather than improvement. Managers who were accustomed to receiving orders found themselves suddenly responsible for decisions they were unprepared to make. Industries that had relied on subsidized inputs struggled to adapt when these subsidies were reduced or eliminated. Price distortions created severe shortages in some sectors and massive surpluses in others. For example, factories continued producing outdated machinery because they lacked incentives or capital to innovate. Meanwhile, millions of consumers faced worsening shortages of basic goods, soap, meat, shoes, household items, that caused frustration and eroded trust in the government. As republics declared sovereignty and began taking control of their own resources, the economic network linking the Soviet Union's vast territory began to fragment. A factory in Belarus could no longer rely on supplies from Russia arriving on time, because Russian ministries were no longer prioritizing union-wide shipments. Ukrainian farms faced fertilizer shortages because Central Asian producers were now selling independently. Energy-rich regions, such as Siberia and Kazakhstan, demanded higher prices for oil and gas, disrupting the entire economic equilibrium. What had once been an integrated, if inefficient, economic machine fractured into pieces that no longer aligned. The Soviet central government attempted to stabilize the situation through emergency measures, but it lacked both authority and enforcement mechanisms. Ministries issued orders that enterprises ignored. The ruble's value plummeted, creating widespread inflation and further destabilizing the system. By 1991, the Soviet planned economy was no longer functioning in any meaningful sense. Factories operated at minimal capacity, workers were paid in goods instead of money, and barter systems replaced formal markets. Entire sectors collapsed, leading to unemployment and economic paralysis. The economy's collapse was not sudden, but accelerated dramatically in the final months of the Union. The command system, which had been held together by political power rather than economic rationality, could not survive once political power itself disintegrated. What followed was not just an economic downturn, but the end of an entire economic paradigm that had shaped the lives of hundreds of millions for generations. The economic collapse of the late Soviet period was not merely a macroeconomic event. It was a profound human crisis felt in every household across the Union. Throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s, ordinary citizens endured hardship that few had experienced even during earlier crises. Long-standing shortages that had once been inconvenient now became intolerable. Supermarket shelves were routinely empty. Families stood in line for hours for basic staples, only to find that supplies had run out by the time they reached the front. In many cities, rationing became the norm. Coupons were issued for bread, sugar, tea, soap, and other essentials. But possessing a coupon did not guarantee that the item would be available. People traded ration coupons with neighbors like currency, reflecting the desperation and uncertainty of daily survival. Inflation, previously suppressed by strict government controls, surged uncontrollably once price restrictions were loosened. The ruble rapidly lost value, and wages could not keep pace. Workers received paychecks that were worth significantly less each month. Savings accumulated over a lifetime became nearly worthless. Pensioners suffered especially severely, as their fixed incomes could not support rising costs. Many retirees were forced to sell personal belongings at street markets simply to afford food. Barter replaced monetary exchange in many towns and villages. People traded clothing, tools, furniture, or homemade goods in exchange for food or basic necessities. The collapse of supply chains affected not only consumer goods, but also essential services. Hospitals faced shortages of medicines, heating fuel, and functioning equipment. Schools lacked supplies, and teachers were often paid months late. Public transportation ran intermittently because buses and trains lacked spare parts. Factories laid off workers or stopped paying wages entirely. In some regions, unemployment reached levels previously unheard of in the Soviet context, where the government traditionally guaranteed jobs. The psychological toll was immense. A society accustomed to state stability, even if imperfect, now found itself plunged into uncertainty, anxiety, and insecurity. Families adapted in creative and desperate ways. Many returned to subsistence farming on dachas or small garden plots to supplement their diets. People left cities to visit relatives in rural areas where food was more plentiful. Informal networks of exchange flourished. Some individuals turned to the burgeoning black market, buying goods illegally from traders who imported supplies from abroad or acquired them through unofficial channels. While these markets provided some relief, they also fueled resentment and inequality, as only those with access to money or connections could afford higher-priced goods. The social fabric frayed under the strain. Crime rates increased as law enforcement institutions weakened. Alcohol consumption rose sharply, contributing to health problems and family stress. Many young people lost faith in government, ideology, and future prospects. Even loyal supporters of socialism began to question whether the system had anything left to offer. The hardship endured during these years fundamentally reshaped public attitudes. Instead of yearning for a reformed socialism, many citizens came to view economic survival as their primary goal, further undermining the legitimacy of the Soviet state. The human suffering of this period played a central role in accelerating the Union's disintegration. The collapse of the command economy left the newly independent republics with a daunting challenge: how to build functioning market economies on the ruins of a system that had never operated according to market principles. None of the former Soviet states had experience with private enterprise, competitive industries, or market-driven pricing. Yet they were suddenly responsible for creating new economic systems almost overnight. The absence of established institutions, commercial banks, private ownership laws, stock markets, and regulatory frameworks made the transition extremely difficult. Nonetheless, many leaders, especially in Russia, believed that rapid transformation was essential to prevent complete economic collapse. In Russia, Boris Yeltsin's government initiated a program of radical economic reforms known as shock therapy. The goal was to dismantle the remnants of the planned economy and create a functioning market system as quickly as possible. Prices were liberalized, ending decades of state price controls. This allowed goods to reappear on the market, but also triggered hyperinflation. Privatization programs were launched to transfer state-owned enterprises into private hands. In theory, this was meant to create a competitive economy. In practice, the process was chaotic and often corrupt. A small group of individuals, later known as oligarchs, acquired vast assets at extremely low prices, gaining enormous wealth and influence. For most citizens, however, the reforms brought hardship rather than prosperity. Other republics followed varied paths. The Baltic states pursued disciplined reforms, establishing clear regulatory frameworks, stabilizing their currencies, and opening their economies to Western investment. Their efforts positioned them for eventual European Union membership. Ukraine attempted gradual reforms, but faced political instability, corruption, and internal divisions that slowed progress. Central Asian states adopted more controlled, state-directed economic transitions, maintaining significant government involvement while allowing limited private enterprise. Despite the difficulties, the shift toward market economies reshaped the region. Private businesses emerged, from small kiosks to large corporations. Foreign investment gradually increased. New entrepreneurs capitalized on opportunities created by the collapse of central planning. Yet the transition also deepened inequality, created economic insecurity, and left many feeling betrayed by promises of rapid prosperity. The legacy of this transition remains deeply controversial, shaping political debates across the former Soviet space even today. The first steps toward market reform signaled a historic transformation, the end of the centrally planned economy, and the beginning of economic systems defined by competition, private ownership, and global integration. While the transition was painful and uneven, it marked the beginning of a new economic era for the post-Soviet world. The collapse of the Soviet Union was not only a political and economic event. It was a profound psychological rupture that reshaped the way people understood themselves, their society, and their place in the world. For 74 years, Soviet ideology had been more than a set of political doctrines. It was the foundation of identity for millions. Citizens were raised with the belief that they belonged to a great power, a nation that had defeated fascism, launched the first human into space, and stood as a global alternative to Western capitalism. The Soviet system had flaws that millions recognized, yet also offered stability, predictability, and a sense of collective purpose. When the USSR collapsed, this entire worldview disintegrated with it. The population was thrust into a world without ideological certainty, without clear direction, and without the institutional structures that had defined Soviet life. This shock was especially pronounced among older generations who had lived their entire lives under the Soviet system. Many struggled to understand how a state that had seemed so powerful, so permanent, could disappear so quickly. The symbols of Soviet pride, flags, parades, institutions, vanished almost overnight. People who had dedicated their careers to state enterprises, party structures, or military service found their roles devalued or irrelevant. Teachers who had taught Marxist-Leninist philosophy saw their subjects discarded. Veterans of the Great Patriotic War wondered what their sacrifices meant in a world that no longer honored the country they fought for. Pensioners who expected the state to support them found themselves living in poverty. This sense of loss, material and emotional, created widespread disorientation and grief. Younger generations experienced a different kind of shock. Many felt excitement at the new freedoms, freedom of speech, opportunities to travel, the ability to start private businesses, but they also encountered uncertainties. The disappearance of the Soviet welfare state meant that job security vanished. Educational and career paths that once followed clear trajectories became unpredictable. Students who had been trained for state industries suddenly found no demand for their skills. Families struggled with financial insecurity. Social institutions, kindergartens, youth organizations, cultural centers that once structured daily life were defunded or disappeared altogether. Many people turned inward, focusing on personal survival rather than collective ideals. This shift from collective identity to individual struggle marked a dramatic transformation in the psychology of post-Soviet society. Religion, which had been suppressed for decades, began to re-emerge, offering spiritual guidance during a time of uncertainty. Churches, mosques, synagogues, and other religious institutions experienced surges in attendance. People sought meaning in faith, community, and tradition as ideological anchors evaporated. National identity also resurfaced. Citizens explored their cultural roots, languages, and histories that had been neglected or censored under Soviet rule. While this cultural revival enriched the region, it also contributed to tensions, as newly independent states asserted their identities in ways that sometimes clashed with those of their neighbors. Thus, the psychological shock of the transition was not a brief moment. It was a long, turbulent process. The end of the Soviet Union forced millions to rebuild their sense of purpose, redefine their identities, and navigate a world in which old certainties had vanished. The emotional and cultural consequences of these changes would shape post-Soviet societies for decades to come. Under the Soviet system, economic equality had been touted as one of the state's defining values. While reality often fell short of propaganda, the USSR did maintain a relatively narrow gap between the highest and lowest incomes. Housing, healthcare, education, and basic necessities were affordable or free. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the sudden shift toward market reforms upended this system entirely. One of the most dramatic changes of the post-Soviet transition was the rapid emergence of inequality on a scale unseen in Soviet history. A small number of individuals accumulated extraordinary wealth, while millions struggled with poverty, unemployment, and declining living conditions. As price controls were lifted, goods became available again, but at prices far beyond what ordinary people could afford. Those with access to hard currency, foreign connections, or early business opportunities quickly seized advantage. Former party elites, enterprise directors, and black market traders often became the first wave of capitalists, using their networks to acquire valuable state assets during privatization processes. This created a new class of wealthy individuals who capitalized on the chaos, eventually becoming influential figures known as oligarchs. Their rise marked a departure from Soviet egalitarianism and sparked widespread resentment. Meanwhile, the majority of the population experienced significant declines in living standards. Real wages collapsed under inflation. Housing quality deteriorated as state funding disappeared. Public services were cut or privatized. Millions of workers lost jobs when factories closed or downsized. Women, who had relied on Soviet-era childcare, healthcare, and workplace policies, faced particular challenges as social services collapsed. Single-parent households struggled to survive. Many families sent younger members abroad to earn money and send remittances home, creating new patterns of migration and demographic shifts. Under the Soviet system, economic equality had been touted as one of the state's defining values. While reality often fell short of propaganda, the USSR did maintain a relatively narrow gap between the highest and lowest incomes. Housing, healthcare, education, and basic necessities were affordable or free. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the sudden shift toward market reforms upended this system entirely. One of the most dramatic changes of the post-Soviet transition was the rapid emergence of inequality on a scale unseen in Soviet history. A small number of individuals accumulated extraordinary wealth, while millions struggled with poverty, unemployment, and declining living conditions. As price controls were lifted, goods became available again, but at prices far beyond what ordinary people could afford. Those with access to hard currency, foreign connections, or early business opportunities quickly seized advantage. Former party elites, enterprise directors, and black market traders often became the first wave of capitalists, using their networks to acquire valuable state assets during privatization processes. This created a new class of wealthy individuals who capitalized on the chaos, eventually becoming influential figures known as oligarchs. Their rise marked a departure from Soviet egalitarianism and sparked widespread resentment. Meanwhile, the majority of the population experienced significant declines in living standards. Real wages collapsed under inflation. Housing quality deteriorated as state funding disappeared. Public services were cut or privatized. Millions of workers lost jobs when factories closed or downsized. Women, who had relied on Soviet-era childcare, healthcare, and workplace policies, faced particular challenges as social services collapsed. Single-parent households struggled to survive. Many families sent younger members abroad to earn money and send remittances home, creating new patterns of migration and demographic shifts. You've just listened to one of the most important stories in modern history. A story of ambition, reform, chaos, courage, collapse, and the rebirth of nations. Today, we saw how one leader tried to save a failing system, how openness unleashed forces no one could control, how entire nations rediscovered their identity, how new conflicts were born from old borders, how Russia fell and rose again, how China learned from a rival's mistakes, how the United States became the world's only superpower, and how the world we live in today still carries the scars and lessons of 1991. The moral of this history is simple but powerful. When a system ignores its people, resists change until it's too late, and loses the trust of its own citizens, collapse becomes inevitable. And when power shifts suddenly, the whole world feels the tremors. Thank you for spending your time with History Teller YT. If you want more epic journeys into the past, more untold stories, and more deep dives that make history come alive. Make sure to return to this channel. Your curiosity is your greatest strength, and here it will always be welcomed. Until next time, this is History Teller YT, signing off. But history never sleeps, and neither do we.